March 2nd, 1992. Victoria DiGiorgio sat in a Brooklyn courtroom wearing a black wool coat and gold earrings, watching 12 jurors file back into their seats. They would not look at her husband. She had learned to read these small gestures over the years. The averted eyes of neighbors when FBI agents appeared at her door. The careful distance maintained by other women at her daughter's wedding. The way her own son sometimes hesitated before answering her questions. Now she watched the jury foreman stand, a middle-aged man in a brown suit who kept his gaze fixed somewhere above John Gotti's head, and she understood what the next words would be before he spoke them. The verdict arrived in a language stripped of mercy, guilty on all counts, including murder. Victoria's hands remained folded in her lap. Cameras outside would later capture her leaving the courthouse, face composed, walking beside her daughter. The photographs show a woman of 50, expensively dressed, her expression revealing nothing. They do not show the previous 30 years, the choices that narrowed into obligations, the love that curdled into endurance, the gradual construction of a life where loyalty became indistinguishable from imprisonment. This is the story of Victoria DiGiorgio, who married John Gotti in 1962 and remained bound to him through violence, incarceration, and death. It is not a story of criminal enterprise or mafia glory. It is the account of what happens to a person who spends 50 years maintaining the appearance of a marriage while living in functional solitude, raising children whose father's profession she could neither escape nor acknowledge, and discovering too late that devotion offered no protection from the consequences it helped create. Victoria DiGiorgio was born in Brooklyn on December 5th, 1942. To parents who had little in common beyond their capacity for silence. Her mother, a Russian Jewish immigrant whose family name was never discussed in detail, had arrived in America carrying stories she would not share with her daughter. Her father was Italian, working class, a man whose presence in the household felt more like an arrangement than a partnership. The marriage functioned on careful avoidance. Certain topics remained unaddressed. Certain questions went unasked. Victoria grew up understanding that family meant learning what not to say. In a neighborhood where everyone was Italian or Irish or Jewish, she existed in the margins between categories. At school, other children asked why her last name sounded Italian, but her mother spoke with an accent they couldn't place. She learned to deflect, to offer partial truths, to become skilled at the kind of social navigation that requires constant attention to what others expect. This was not a lesson taught explicitly. It was absorbed through observation, through watching her mother's careful performance of belonging in a community that never quite accepted her. The household operated according to unspoken rules. Her father worked long hours at jobs Victoria never fully understood. Her mother maintained the apartment with a meticulousness that suggested she was always preparing for inspection. Money was discussed in whispers, always in terms of what they couldn't afford rather than what they had. Victoria wore clothes that were clean but never new, passed down from cousins or purchased from shops where the merchandise carried the faint smell of other people's lives. She was 12 when her mother fell ill for the first time, an illness that arrived without warning and departed without explanation, leaving behind only a new fragility that made Victoria responsible for tasks she hadn't been taught. She learned to cook by necessity, to manage a household budget that never stretched far enough, to become the bridge between her silent father and her increasingly withdrawn mother. The weight of this responsibility felt less like a burden than like confirmation of something she had always suspected, that her value lay in her usefulness, her ability to smooth over difficulties and maintain appearances. By 14, Victoria had developed the manner of someone twice her age. Teachers noted her seriousness, her lack of interest in the casual socializing that occupied other girls. She had friends, but kept them at a distance that prevented real intimacy. After school, while other teenagers gathered at corner stores or walked home in loud groups, Victoria returned to the apartment to prepare dinner, to check on her mother, to ensure that the visible surface of their lives remained undisturbed. Her mother's illness worsened gradually. The details were never explained to Victoria in full, only that there were doctor's appointments that couldn't be missed, medications that had to be taken at specific times, good days and bad days that arrived without pattern. Victoria became skilled at reading her mother's face for signs of pain, at adjusting her own behavior to accommodate shifting moods, at bearing witness to suffering she had no power to alleviate. The apartment in Brooklyn became smaller as Victoria grew older. She began to recognize it as a place of limitation rather than safety. Her father's long absences, her mother's illness, the financial constraints that dictated every decision. These were not temporary circumstances to be endured, but permanent conditions that would shape her indefinitely unless she found a way out. The problem was that escape required resources she didn't possess and a vision of an alternative life she couldn't quite imagine. At 16, Victoria left school. The decision was presented as practical necessity. Her mother needed help, the family needed her income, but it also represented the closing of a door she had never been certain she wanted to walk through. She found work in a factory, repetitive labor that paid weekly and asked nothing of her beyond physical presence. The other women who worked alongside her were older, resigned to lives that had narrowed into routines of work and obligation. Victoria listened to their conversations about husbands who disappointed them, children who never called, dreams that had evaporated so gradually they couldn't identify the moment of loss. She understood that she was looking at her future. The realization arrived without drama, simply as a fact to be acknowledged. This was what happened to girls who lacked education, connections, or the particular kind of beauty that opened doors. They worked until they married, and then they worked differently, exchanging factory labor for domestic labor, substituting one form of exhaustion for another. Marriage was not presented as a romantic proposition, but as an economic transaction, a trade of youth and fertility for financial security and social legitimacy. Victoria saved money with a discipline that bordered on obsession. She kept her earnings in a drawer beneath her clothes, adding to it each week, imagining it as a resource that might someday allow for choices she couldn't yet name. But the money accumulated slowly, and the cost of independence, an apartment of her own, furnishings, the kind of respectable job that might support her, remained impossibly distant. The mathematics of her situation were clear. Alone, she would always be struggling. Marriage, if she chose correctly, might offer something better. Her mother's illness entered a new phase when Victoria was 18. The details remained vague, but the reality was unmistakable. There would be no recovery, only management of decline. Victoria watched her mother become smaller, quieter, more absent even when physically present. Her father retreated further into silence, his inability to address what was happening manifesting as longer work hours and an almost deliberate avoidance of the apartment. Victoria found herself caring for someone who was disappearing in slow motion, performing tasks that felt both essential and futile. It was during this period that she began to understand the particular loneliness of being needed. Her mother depended on her completely, but this dependence created no intimacy, no deepening of their relationship. Instead, it transformed Victoria into a functionary, someone whose value lay entirely in what she could provide. Love, if it existed, had become indistinguishable from duty. Care had become a form of imprisonment, disguised as devotion. When Victoria met John Gotti in 1958, she was 20 years old and exhausted by a life that felt like it had already ended. She was ready for rescue. She had no framework for recognizing that the man offering it might simply be offering a different kind of cage. John Gotti was 22 when Victoria first saw him at a bar in Brooklyn, leaning against the counter with the posture of someone accustomed to being watched. He wore his clothes with attention, pressed shirt, polished shoes, hair combed back with precision. Other men in the room seemed to arrange themselves around him, waiting for his attention, laughing at his jokes before he finished delivering them. Victoria noticed this immediately. She had spent her life observing social hierarchies, learning to identify who held power and who performed deference, and John Gotti was clearly someone others deferred to. He approached her with confidence that felt rehearsed but effective. The conversation moved quickly past pleasantries into something that resembled intimacy, without requiring actual disclosure. John asked questions that made Victoria feel seen about her work, her family, her opinions on matters she hadn't realized she had opinions about. He listened with focus that seemed complete, as though her words mattered more than anything else in the room. This quality, the ability to make someone feel singular, would prove to be among his most dangerous talents. Victoria learned quickly that John came from a large family, that his father worked intermittently, that he had grown up in circumstances similar to her own. What she didn't learn, because he didn't offer and she didn't ask, was how he earned money. The question felt inappropriate, almost rude, the kind of inquiry that suggested distrust. John always had cash. He paid for dinners without checking prices, bought her gifts that weren't extravagant but were thoughtful, maintained a car that was clean and functional. The source of this money remained unexamined. Their courtship followed patterns that felt traditional on the surface. John picked her up at her apartment, met her parents with appropriate respect, returned her home at reasonable hours. But underneath this performance of propriety ran a current Victoria couldn't quite name. John's friends appeared and disappeared without explanation. His schedule was unpredictable. Sometimes he was available every evening for a week, then absent for days without warning. When Victoria asked about these absences, his explanations were vague, but delivered with such certainty that pressing further felt like an accusation. 6 months into their relationship, Victoria's mother died. The death came in the early morning, a final breath that Victoria witnessed alone because her father was at work, and there had been no warning that this particular night would be different from the others. Victoria sat with the body for 20 minutes before calling anyone, struck by how little her mother's absence changed the physical appearance of the room. The woman who had occupied so much of Victoria's attention for years simply stopped, and the world continued without pause. John appeared at the funeral in a dark suit, standing slightly apart from Victoria's family, his presence suggesting protection without intimacy. He handled arrangements Victoria couldn't manage, speaking to funeral directors, ensuring her father ate something, deflecting relatives whose grief manifested as invasive questions. In the days following the burial, John visited the apartment daily, his competence filling spaces Victoria's father had abandoned through emotional paralysis. She found herself grateful for this, for someone who could function when she felt capable of nothing. The proposal came 3 months after her mother's death. They were sitting in John's car outside her apartment when he told her he wanted to marry her. There was no question in his phrasing, no request for consideration. He presented it as a decision he had made that she would naturally agree to. Victoria said yes immediately, surprising herself with the speed of her acceptance. Later, she would try to remember if she had felt joy in that moment or simply relief at having a direction, a purpose, a role that felt more substantial than the one she had been occupying. Planning the wedding revealed dynamics Victoria had not anticipated. John's family was large, loud, and operated according to rules she didn't understand. His mother examined Victoria with an assessment that felt clinical, asking questions about her cooking skills, her church attendance, her plans for children. His brothers treated her with a politeness that maintained careful distance, as though her position in John's life was provisional, subject to revocation if she failed to meet standards that would never be articulated clearly. Money for the wedding appeared without explanation. John handled everything: the venue, the reception, the guest list that expanded beyond anyone Victoria knew. When she asked about costs, he dismissed her concerns with a wave that suggested the question itself was inappropriate. She learned not to ask. She learned that certain topics were designated as John's domain, and that her role was to trust rather than inquire. The wedding took place on March 6, 1962, at a church in Brooklyn. Victoria wore white lace and carried flowers someone else had selected. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of faces she didn't recognize, and rituals that felt like performance for an audience whose approval mattered more than hers. At the reception, John moved through the crowd with ease, greeting men who clapped him on the back and spoke in tones too low for Victoria to hear. She sat at the head table, smiling when appropriate, accepting congratulations from strangers who told her how lucky she was. The honeymoon lasted 3 days. A hotel in the Catskills where John spent much of the time on the phone, conversations he took in the lobby or outside their room. Victoria didn't complain. She was learning the fundamental rule of her new life. John's business, whatever it was, took precedence over everything else, and her acceptance of this fact was the price of admission. They returned to an apartment John had rented in Queens, a space larger than anywhere Victoria had lived before. The rent was paid for months in advance. The furniture was new. John's generosity felt less like affection than like compensation for something he couldn't offer directly. His consistent presence, his full attention, his willingness to build a life that revolved around anything other than the mysterious work that called him away at irregular hours. Victoria was 20 years old. She had traded her mother's dying apartment for a husband's well-furnished one. She had exchanged one form of caretaking for another, one kind of silence for a different variety. Within a year, she would be pregnant with their first child, beginning a process that would occupy the next decade and provide both purpose and distraction from the gradual realization that she had married a man who would never be fully available to her. Victoria discovered she was pregnant 4 months after the wedding. The pregnancy arrived with the inevitability of something expected rather than chosen, a biological consequence of marriage that required no discussion. John received the news with satisfaction that seemed disconnected from any understanding of what it would require from her. He celebrated with his brothers, buying drinks and accepting congratulations, while Victoria sat home calculating how long her maternity clothes would need to last, and whether the apartment's second bedroom was large enough for a nursery. Angela, their first daughter, was born in 1961. The labor lasted 14 hours. John was not present. He had been called away on business he didn't specify, arriving at the hospital 3 hours after the birth with flowers and apologies that felt practiced. Victoria held their daughter and understood with sudden clarity that this child would be primarily her responsibility. John's life would continue largely unchanged. Hers had just reorganized completely around the needs of someone who could not be ignored or postponed. The early months of motherhood passed in a blur of feeding schedules and sleepless nights. Victoria's days collapsed into routines dictated by Angela's needs. Bottles prepared, diapers changed, laundry that multiplied beyond any reasonable proportion. John came and went according to patterns Victoria stopped trying to predict. Sometimes he was home for dinner 3 nights in a row, playing with Angela and discussing plans for their future. Then he would disappear for days, offering no explanation beyond vague references to work that needed handling. Victoria stopped asking questions. She learned that inquiry led only to irritation. John's mood would shift from affectionate to cold when pressed for details about his absences. Other wives in their building seemed to accept similar arrangements. Their husbands worked long hours, came home tired, expected dinner ready, and children quiet. Victoria joined these women in the building's courtyard, listening to their complaints about money and exhaustion, their resigned acceptance that marriage meant managing households alone while maintaining the fiction of partnership. Victoria Jr. was born in 1962, barely 13 months after Angela. The second pregnancy had not been planned, arriving before Victoria's body had fully recovered from the first birth. She was pregnant again before her daughter learned to walk, facing the prospect of 2 children in diapers simultaneously. John seemed pleased by this productivity, as though each child confirmed something about his virility or success. He did not seem to register that Victoria now spent her days managing needs that never paused, that her life had narrowed to the physical space of their apartment and the temporal space between feedings. Money was never discussed, but always present as an undertone. John provided generously. The rent was paid, groceries appeared. Victoria never had to ask for cash when the children needed clothes, but the source of this money remained obscure. John didn't leave for work at regular hours. He didn't carry a lunch pail or wear a uniform. Men came to their apartment at odd times, speaking with John in the kitchen, while Victoria kept the children in the bedroom. She learned to recognize certain names mentioned repeatedly, to notice when John's mood shifted based on phone calls he took in hushed tones. In 1964, John was arrested for the first time since their marriage. The charge was burglary. Victoria learned about it when police appeared at her door asking for him, their questions polite but their purpose unmistakable. John was released within days, the charges eventually dismissed through means Victoria didn't understand. He came home acting as though nothing had happened, resuming his routines without explanation. Victoria asked no questions. She was learning that ignorance could be strategic, that not knowing protected her from having to decide what she would do with knowledge. John III was born in 1964. Victoria now had 3 children under the age of 4. The apartment that had seemed spacious when they married now felt claustrophobic, filled with cribs and high chairs and toys that multiplied despite her efforts at organization. She rarely left the building except for necessary errands. The pediatrician's office, the grocery store, the park on days when the weather permitted, and she had energy to wrangle 3 small children through public space. Her days began at dawn and ended long after the children slept, filled with tasks that generated no visible progress. She cooked meals that were consumed and immediately required preparation again. She washed clothes that were dirtied before they were fully dry. She soothed crying that stopped only to resume hours later. The work was constant and circular, producing nothing except the continued survival of people too young to understand what their survival cost. John's absences grew longer. Nights when he didn't come home became frequent enough that Victoria stopped setting a place for him at dinner. She established routines that didn't depend on his presence, bedtime rituals that involved only her and the children, weekends structured around activities she could manage alone. The children began to treat their father's appearances as events rather than expectations. They would grow excited when he walked through the door, clustering around him for attention, then gradually adjust back to his absence when he left again. In 1965, John was arrested for attempted burglary and assault. This time the charges resulted in a conviction. He was sentenced to 3 years, but served less than 2. Victoria visited him in prison with the children, a trip that required coordinating car seats and diaper bags and snacks to keep 3 young children quiet during the drive and the wait in visiting rooms designed without consideration for families. The visits were brief, supervised, conducted through glass or in rooms where guards watched constantly. John held John III, who didn't remember him well enough to be comfortable in his arms. During John's incarceration, money arrived through channels Victoria didn't ask about. Envelopes appeared in her mailbox, cash with no explanation attached. John's brothers stopped by occasionally, asking if she needed anything, their assistance carrying an undertone of obligation rather than generosity. Victoria accepted what was offered. She had 3 children and no job skills that would support them. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Frank was born in 1967, shortly after John's release, then Peter in 1974. 5 children across 12 years, each pregnancy arriving in the space between John's incarcerations and his absences for work that was never discussed. Victoria's 20s and early 30s disappeared into the relentless demands of raising children whose father was present only intermittently, whose family name carried weight in their neighborhood that Victoria didn't fully understand but had learned not to question. She had become exactly what she had tried to avoid, a woman whose life consisted entirely of caring for others, whose identity existed only in relation to her children, and a husband she saw less frequently than she saw the mailman. March 18, 1980. Frank Gotti was 12 years old, riding a borrowed minibike in the street near their Howard Beach home. Victoria was inside preparing dinner, the kind of ordinary Tuesday evening that would later feel impossible to reconcile with what followed. She heard the collision before she understood what it meant, the sound of impact, then screaming that brought her to the window. A neighbor's car had struck Frank as he crossed the street. The driver, John Favara, lived 4 blocks away. He had not been speeding. Frank had darted out from behind a dumpster, and Favara had no time to brake. These facts would be established later, confirmed by witnesses, acknowledged even by police who investigated the accident. None of it mattered. Victoria ran into the street to find her son lying on the asphalt, his body broken in ways that made clear no hospital could repair. Frank died at the hospital. Victoria was holding his hand when it happened, John standing beside her in silence that felt like compression, all the air leaving the room at once. The doctor offered words meant to be comforting. Frank hadn't suffered long. The injuries were too severe for consciousness. There was nothing anyone could have done. Victoria heard these statements without processing them. She was listening instead to the absence of sound, the monitors that had stopped beeping, the sudden quiet that confirmed her son no longer existed in the world. The funeral was held 4 days later. Victoria moved through it in a state that resembled function without consciousness. She dressed in black. She received mourners. She listened to prayers delivered by a priest whose face she wouldn't remember an hour later. The church was full of people, John's family, neighbors, men whose connection to her husband she had never questioned, and wouldn't start now. They offered condolences and practiced phrases that required no response beyond nodding acknowledgement. John's grief manifested differently. He was silent in ways that felt dangerous, his usual animation replaced by a stillness that made people nervous. Victoria watched him at the funeral, standing apart from the family, his jaw set in an expression she had learned to recognize as rage held barely in check. She knew without being told that John would not accept Frank's death as an accident. In his world, everything had a responsible party, and responsibility required payment. John Favara began receiving threats immediately. His car was spray painted with the word murderer. Someone firebombed his vehicle while it sat in his driveway. Neighbors who had lived on the same street for decades stopped speaking to him. His wife received anonymous calls in the middle of the night, voices telling her to leave Howard Beach before something worse happened. Favara reported these incidents to police, who documented them and could do nothing to prevent what was coming. Victoria knew John was behind this campaign of terror. She knew it with the certainty that comes from 20 years of marriage, from understanding how her husband thought and what he considered justice. She said nothing. Part of her recognized that Favara was being punished for an accident, that her son's death was tragedy rather than murder. But a larger part of her, the part consumed by grief that had no outlet, found grim satisfaction in Favara's fear. If she had to live with this loss, then the man who caused it should live with consequences. In July, 4 months after Frank's death, John Favara disappeared. He was last seen leaving his job at a furniture factory, getting into his car in the parking lot. The car was found abandoned 2 days later. Favara's body was never recovered. Police investigated but made no arrests. Witnesses who might have seen something proved remarkably unobservant when questioned. The case remained open as a missing persons investigation, though everyone in Howard Beach understood that Favara was dead and who had ordered it. Victoria learned about Favara's disappearance from a neighbor who mentioned it carefully, watching Victoria's face for reaction. Victoria expressed surprise, said something about hoping he was found safely, returned to her kitchen to finish preparing dinner. That night, lying beside John in bed, she waited for him to mention it. He didn't. The silence between them contained knowledge neither would acknowledge aloud. Favara's disappearance became another topic that didn't require discussion, another truth that existed in the space between what they knew and what they pretended not to know. Frank's death changed the architecture of their family in ways that couldn't be repaired. His bedroom remained untouched for months, Victoria unable to pack his clothes or remove the posters from his walls. She found herself standing in the doorway at odd hours, looking at the space where her son had slept, trying to reconcile the physical absence with the continued presence of his belongings. The other children moved around this shrine carefully, understanding without being told that their mother's grief required this preservation. Angela retreated into silence that worried Victoria, but that she had no energy to address. Victoria Jr. became angry in ways that manifested as fights at school and defiance at home. John III, who had been Frank's closest companion, stopped eating regularly and lost weight that made him look skeletal. Peter was only 6 and seemed confused by the sudden absence, asking questions about when Frank was coming home that Victoria couldn't answer without breaking down. John buried himself in work. His absences grew longer and more frequent. When he was home, he was physically present but emotionally unavailable, sitting at the dinner table in silence, or leaving the room when Frank's name was mentioned. Victoria understood that he was grieving in the only way he knew, through action, through the exercise of power and control in domains where these things mattered. His son's death couldn't be undone, but the man responsible could be erased, and this erasure seemed to be the only comfort John could access. Victoria's grief had nowhere to go. She couldn't speak about it with John, who shut down any conversation that approached emotional territory. She couldn't burden her children, who were struggling with their own loss. The women in her neighborhood offered sympathy, but maintained distance. They understood that Frank's death and Favara's disappearance were connected, and proximity to the Gotti family had become more dangerous than it had been before. She began to understand that Frank's death had revealed something she had spent years avoiding. The violence that funded their lives wasn't abstract or distant. It existed in their neighborhood, affected people they knew, and now it had touched her family directly. Her son had died in an accident. Another man had died because of it. And Victoria was complicit through her silence, through her refusal to ask questions she didn't want answered. December 1985. Paul Castellano was murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, shot multiple times while exiting his car. The killing was efficient, public, and sent a message that reorganized power structures. Victoria had never fully understood but had learned to live adjacent to. John came home that night later than usual, his mood buoyant in ways she hadn't seen since before Frank's death. He didn't tell her what had happened. She learned about it the next morning from television news, watching footage of a body covered with a sheet on a Manhattan sidewalk, while the reporter described a brazen mob assassination. Within weeks, it became clear that John had ascended to a position of power that would transform their lives completely. He was now head of the Gambino crime family, one of the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York. This wasn't information John shared directly with Victoria. It was something she pieced together from news reports, from the increased deference shown by men who visited their home, from the way neighbors suddenly became more careful in their interactions with her family. The money increased, not gradually, but dramatically. John moved them to a larger house in Howard Beach, a 2-story property with a basement and a yard that required professional maintenance. The furniture was replaced with pieces that looked expensive because they were expensive. Victoria's wardrobe expanded to include clothes she would never have purchased for herself. Designer labels, jewelry that came in velvet boxes, fur coats she wore to family dinners, and church services. She understood that these possessions were not gifts, but requirements. As the wife of John Gotti, she was expected to look a certain way, to project wealth and success that reflected her husband's status. The pressure came not from John directly, but from observation. Watching how other wives in their social circle dressed, noticing the attention paid to appearances at family gatherings, understanding that her presentation was being evaluated constantly by women whose approval she hadn't sought, but needed to maintain. The FBI began following her in 1986. She noticed the cars parked outside their house, different vehicles but always the same quality of attention from men sitting inside them. When she drove to the grocery store, they followed at a distance that suggested they wanted her to know they were there. When she picked up her children from school, the agents were visible in her rearview mirror. The surveillance was meant to intimidate, and it succeeded. Victoria began to feel like a performer in a show she hadn't auditioned for. Every movement watched and potentially recorded. John seemed energized by the attention. He dressed more carefully than before, wearing suits that photographers would later describe as costing thousands of dollars. His hair was always perfect. His shoes always shined. The newspapers began calling him the Dapper Don, a nickname that treated his appearance as somehow relevant to his position as head of a criminal organization. John collected these articles, reading them with satisfaction that suggested he enjoyed the celebrity more than he worried about the legal scrutiny it invited. Victoria appeared in photographs beside him, always slightly behind, her expression neutral. She learned to school her features into blankness, to reveal nothing that could be interpreted or misinterpreted. The cameras captured her outside courthouses, at restaurants, leaving church on Sundays. She never spoke to reporters, never responded to questions shouted at her from across parking lots. Her silence was strategic and necessary. Anything she said could be used against John, could provide ammunition for prosecutors building cases against him. The trials began in 1986 and continued with relentless frequency. Federal prosecutors charged John with racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Each trial required Victoria's presence in the courtroom, sitting in seats reserved for family members, maintaining composure while evidence of her husband's criminal activities was presented to juries. She listened to FBI agents testify about surveillance that had captured John ordering violence, discussing illegal business, planning crimes that would justify decades in prison. The trials also required her performance outside the courthouse. Photographers waited for her arrival and departure, capturing images that would appear in newspapers the next day. Victoria learned to dress for these occasions with careful attention. Conservative but expensive, projecting a respectability that contradicted everything being said about her husband inside the courtroom. She smiled occasionally, just enough to suggest confidence, without appearing callous. She held her daughter's hand, a visual reminder that John was a family man, not just a criminal defendant. John was acquitted in 3 consecutive trials between 1986 and 1990. Each acquittal was celebrated as a victory, proof that the government couldn't make their charges stick, evidence of John's invincibility. Victoria attended the celebrations, dinners at expensive restaurants, parties where champagne flowed, and men toasted John's continued freedom. She smiled and accepted congratulations, playing the role of grateful wife while understanding that each acquittal only ensured more trials would follow. The attention was suffocating. Reporters called her home asking for comments. Tabloid journalists published articles speculating about her marriage, her children, her knowledge of John's criminal activities. Photographers waited outside her house, taking pictures of her taking out the trash, getting the mail, backing her car out of the driveway. Her life had become public property, available for consumption and commentary by strangers who felt entitled to opinions about choices she had made decades earlier. Her children suffered differently under this scrutiny. Angela had married and moved away, creating distance from the family name that seemed intentional. Victoria Jr. struggled with the attention, alternating between embracing the notoriety and resenting it. John III was following his father into the life, a trajectory that Victoria watched with helplessness that had calcified into resignation. Peter, the youngest, was still in school, dealing with classmates and teachers who knew exactly who his father was. Victoria's role had narrowed to a single function, maintaining the appearance of a normal family despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She hosted holiday dinners where family members avoided discussing anything meaningful. She attended her children's events and pretended not to notice other parents' careful distance. She went to church and sat in pews while other parishioners whispered, their speculation about her knowledge and complicity conducted in voices just loud enough for her to hear. The house in Howard Beach, with its new furniture and maintained yard, felt less like a home than a stage set. Victoria moved through rooms that were photographed for magazine articles about mob families, spaces that had been decorated to project success but felt empty of anything personal. She slept beside a man who was photographed more than he was home, whose celebrity had eclipsed whatever intimacy might have existed between them. January 1990. Victoria sat in federal court for what felt like the 100th time, though it was only the 4th major trial. This one was different. The prosecutors had evidence they hadn't possessed before, recordings from bugs planted in the Ravenite Social Club, where John conducted business he had believed was private. The tapes captured his voice discussing murders, ordering assaults, dividing criminal proceeds. Victoria listened to her husband's recorded voice fill the courtroom, his words stripped of context and presented as proof of the life she had spent 30 years not discussing. The trial stretched across months. Victoria attended daily, sitting in the same seat, wearing variations of the same conservative dress and pearls. The routine became its own form of imprisonment. Wake early, dress carefully, drive to the courthouse, pass through security, sit in the gallery while prosecutors methodically dismantled any pretense that John's business was legitimate. The lunch breaks were brief, eaten quickly in courthouse cafeterias where other defendants' families sat at separate tables, everyone maintaining careful distance from contamination by association. Bruce Cutler, John's attorney, argued that the recordings were taken out of context, that the government had entrapped his client, that the prosecution was motivated by publicity rather than justice. Victoria watched the jury's faces during these arguments and saw skepticism that mirrored her own. The tapes were damning not because they were ambiguous, but because they were explicit. John's voice discussing the murder of Paul Castellano, planning the killing of Louis de Bono, ordering violence against anyone who threatened his position. These weren't statements that could be explained away through clever lawyering. Outside the courthouse, the media circus intensified. Television trucks lined the street, reporters doing live broadcasts about the trial's proceedings, photographers waiting for shots of John arriving and leaving. Victoria was always in these photographs, visible but silent. Her presence used to humanize or demonize John, depending on the publication's perspective. The tabloids ran headlines about mob wife's loyalty and standing by her man, treating her devotion as either admirable or pathological, depending on what sold more papers. John seemed to thrive on the attention, even as the evidence mounted against him. He waved to cameras, smiled for photographers, maintained the performance of confidence that had characterized his public persona since becoming boss. Victoria recognized this as denial, masquerading as strength, but she said nothing. Her role was to support, not to question, to stand beside him in photographs while privately understanding that this trial would end differently than the previous ones. The prosecution called witness after witness, former associates who had turned government informants, FBI agents who had conducted surveillance, forensic accountants who traced money through shell corporations, and cash businesses. Each testimony added detail to a picture that was already clear. John Gotti had run a criminal empire for years, profiting from activities that included murder, extortion, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. Victoria sat through testimony about crimes she had never asked about, filling in gaps in her understanding of how their lifestyle had been funded. Salvatore Gravano's testimony was the most damaging. Sammy the Bull had been John's underboss, his closest associate, a man who had sat at their dinner table and played with their children. Now he was describing murders he and John had committed together, providing details only someone present could know. Victoria watched John's face as Gravano testified, seeing rage that he couldn't express in the courtroom, fury at betrayal that eclipsed any concern about the legal consequences. The testimony lasted days. Gravano described 19 murders he had participated in, many ordered by John. He explained the structure of the Gambino family, the rituals of organized crime, the economics of protection rackets, and illegal gambling. He answered prosecutors' questions with specificity that made clear he was telling the truth, not because he had suddenly developed morality, but because cooperation offered him a reduced sentence and witness protection. Victoria understood that Gravano's testimony would seal John's fate. The previous acquittals had been possible because prosecutors couldn't prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. Now they had an insider willing to describe crimes in detail, corroborated by recordings of John's own voice. The jury was hearing testimony that made conviction not just possible, but inevitable. The defense tried to discredit Gravano, pointing out that he was a confessed murderer willing to say anything to reduce his sentence. But this strategy only reinforced the prosecution's case, that John had surrounded himself with violent criminals, that his organization operated through intimidation and murder, that the world he had built required exactly the kind of men who would eventually betray him to save themselves. Victoria's children attended sporadically. Angela came once and didn't return, unable to bear hearing the specifics of what their father had done. Victoria Jr. sat through several days of testimony before stopping, her anger at the government's case gradually transforming into something else as she heard the evidence. John III attended regularly, his loyalty to his father unshaken by testimony that would have disturbed anyone with less investment in maintaining the fiction of John's innocence. The trial consumed Victoria's life for months. She had no identity outside of being John Gotti's wife, no role beyond appearing in court and projecting loyalty. The women who had been her friends maintained distance, not wanting to be associated with a family under such intense scrutiny. She ate meals alone, spent evenings in a house that felt larger and emptier each day, waited for a verdict she knew would destroy what remained of their life together. April 2nd, 1992. The jury returned after 13 hours of deliberation. Victoria knew before the foreman spoke that they had reached a guilty verdict. She had learned to read these moments, to interpret the subtle signals that preceded formal announcements. The foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts, including 5 murders and racketeering. John's face remained impassive. Victoria's hands were folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing, while her internal world collapsed completely. The sentencing came months later, life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge described John as the head of a violent criminal organization that had terrorized New York for decades. John was given opportunity to speak and declined. Victoria sat in the gallery and understood that she would never again share a home with her husband, that the rest of her life would be structured around prison visits and phone calls monitored by federal authorities, that she had become permanently tethered to a man she would only see through glass or in supervised rooms. The United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, was 900 miles from Howard Beach. Victoria made the drive every week for the first year, a journey that required leaving before dawn and returning after dark. The prison was maximum security, designed for inmates considered too dangerous for standard facilities. John was held in solitary confinement 23 hours a day, a punishment the Bureau of Prisons justified as necessary given his position in organized crime. Visits were conducted in a small room with guards present, conversation limited to 30 minutes, physical contact restricted to a brief embrace at the beginning and end. Victoria sat across a metal table from her husband and talked about things that didn't matter: the weather, The children's activities, repairs needed on the house. They avoided discussing the appeal which John's lawyers had filed immediately and which everyone understood would fail. They avoided discussing the conditions of his imprisonment. They avoided discussing anything that acknowledged the permanence of their situation. The prison visits revealed John in ways their marriage never had. Without the performance of power, without the audience of men who deferred to him, without the expensive suits and careful grooming, he looked smaller. Prison had stripped away the identity he had constructed, leaving someone Victoria recognized but didn't know how to talk to. Their conversations were stilted, filled with silences that stretched uncomfortably. Two people who had shared a life for 30 years, discovering they had little to say to each other when the structure of that life had been removed. Victoria's weeks organized themselves around these visits. She planned her route, packed food for the drive, arranged her schedule to ensure nothing interfered with the trip to Marion. The visits became the only thing that gave her life structure, an obligation that felt like purpose, even as she recognized it was really just another form of imprisonment. She was free to leave the prison at the end of each visit, but her life was no less constrained by John's incarceration than his was. Money became a concern for the first time in years. The government had seized assets they claimed were purchased with criminal proceeds, bank accounts, property, vehicles. What remained was enough to maintain the house, but not the lifestyle Victoria had grown accustomed to. She shopped more carefully, comparing prices and using coupons, activities that felt humiliating after years of buying whatever she wanted without checking costs. The women who had envied her wealth now saw her at discount stores, and their pity was worse than their envy had been. John's appeals were denied systematically. The Second Circuit upheld his conviction in 1993. The Supreme Court declined to hear his case in 1994. Each denial arrived as a formal letter that Victoria read alone in her kitchen, the legal language confirming what she already knew. John would die in prison, and she would spend whatever years she had left visiting him in facilities designed to break men like him. The Bureau of Prisons transferred John to the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, in 1996. The new facility was even more secure than Marion, a supermax prison where inmates were held in 8 by 12-foot cells with no human contact beyond guards. Victoria's visits now required flights instead of drives, expenses that strained her budget and made weekly trips impossible. She reduced her visits to monthly, then to every 6 weeks. The gaps between seeing John growing longer out of financial necessity she resented but couldn't overcome. The children visited rarely. Angela had stopped coming entirely, her relationship with John damaged beyond repair by the trial testimony she couldn't unhear. Victoria Jr. came occasionally, her visits brief and tense conversations with her father consisting mostly of small talk that avoided anything meaningful. John III visited more regularly but seemed to treat these trips as obligations rather than desires, fulfilling filial duty without evidence of genuine connection. Victoria's life narrowed to routines that required no thought. She maintained the house mechanically, cooking meals for one and eating them standing at the kitchen counter. She watched television without processing what she was seeing. She attended church on Sundays and sat in back pews, grateful that most parishioners had stopped trying to engage her in conversation. Her social isolation was complete, self-imposed, but also enforced by a community that didn't know how to interact with a woman whose husband was serving life for murder. In 1998, doctors diagnosed John with throat cancer. The prison provided treatment that was adequate but not comprehensive, radiation therapy that left him weakened and nauseous. Victoria learned about his illness through phone calls that were monitored and recorded, John's voice already deteriorating, his words harder to understand each time they spoke. She requested compassionate release, a petition that was denied immediately. John Gotti would not be released early regardless of his medical condition. Victoria watched her husband die in increments. Each visit revealed further deterioration, weight loss that made his prison uniform hang loose, skin that took on a grayish pallor, hair that fell out in patches from radiation. The cancer progressed despite treatment, spreading from his throat to his lymph nodes, then to his lungs. John became someone Victoria had to lean close to hear, his voice reduced to whispers that guards sometimes couldn't monitor effectively, giving them the first private conversations they'd had in years. but they had nothing private to say. John didn't apologize for the choices that had led to this ending. Victoria didn't express resentment about a life spent supporting decisions she'd had no part in making. They talked instead about grandchildren John would never meet, about repairs needed on the house, about whether Victoria should sell the property and move somewhere smaller. These practical discussions substituted for emotional honesty, allowing them to maintain the pattern of avoidance that had characterized their entire marriage. The final visit came in May 2002. John was in the prison hospital, too weak to sit upright for long periods. Victoria sat beside his bed for hours, holding his hand, while machines monitored vital signs that were failing systematically. He died on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61. Victoria received notification by phone from prison officials who expressed perfunctory condolences before explaining procedures for claiming his body. The funeral was held in Queens, a spectacle that attracted media attention despite John having been imprisoned for a decade. Victoria sat in the front pew and watched mourners file past the casket. Family members, old associates who had managed to avoid prosecution, curiosity seekers who wanted to witness the end of the Dapper Don. She accepted condolences with the same blank expression she had maintained throughout the trial years, revealing nothing, while photographers captured her grief for newspapers that would print the images alongside retrospectives of John's criminal career. Victoria was 60 years old. She had been married for 40 years, 30 of which had been structured around managing the consequences of John's choices while having no input into those choices. John III was arrested in 1998, charged with racketeering as part of an investigation into the Gambino family's continued operations. Victoria learned about it from a phone call, her son's voice trying to sound reassuring while explaining that this was a misunderstanding, that his lawyers would handle it, that she shouldn't worry. She recognized the tone. It was the same one John had used during his early arrests, the casual dismissal of legal trouble as temporary inconvenience rather than inevitable consequence. The charges were not a misunderstanding. Prosecutors presented evidence that John III had assumed a leadership role in the Gambino family, following his father's path with a precision that suggested either devotion or inability to imagine alternatives. Wiretaps captured him discussing criminal business, organizing illegal activities, operating within the same structure that had destroyed his father. Victoria sat through another trial in another courthouse, watching her son convicted of crimes that would send him to prison for 6 years. She had tried to prevent this. After John's conviction, she had told her sons explicitly that the life was over, that continuing in organized crime would only lead to prison or death, that they had opportunities their father never had and should use them. John III had listened with the polite attention children give parents whose advice they plan to ignore, then continued doing exactly what he wanted. Victoria's warnings carried no weight against the appeal of power, money, and the family legacy he seemed determined to inherit, regardless of cost. Peter was arrested in 2002, just months after his father's funeral. The charges were similar: racketeering, extortion, money laundering. He was 28 years old, married with children, and apparently convinced that he could succeed where his father and brother had failed. Victoria visited him in jail before his trial, sitting across from her youngest son and asking why he had made choices he knew would lead to this outcome. Peter's answer was vague, something about family loyalty and obligations she didn't understand. She recognized that he was lying, that the real answer involved pride and stupidity, and the seductive belief that he was smarter than the law. Peter pleaded guilty and received a 25-year sentence. Victoria attended the sentencing hearing and listened to prosecutors describe her son as a violent criminal who had threatened witnesses, ordered assaults, and participated in criminal conspiracies. The description was accurate, but felt impossible to reconcile with the child she had raised, the boy who had been gentle with animals and cried when his brother Frank died. She didn't know when that child had disappeared, or if he had ever really existed outside her need to see him as innocent. Victoria Jr. had chosen distance instead of crime. She maintained contact with her mother but avoided family gatherings where the business was discussed, where men spoke in codes they believed were subtle but were transparent to anyone paying attention. She had married someone outside the life, moved to a different neighborhood, created boundaries that protected her children from the legacy that had consumed their uncles. Victoria was grateful for this, but also resentful. Her daughter's escape felt like abandonment. like judgment of choices Victoria had made that her daughter refused to replicate. Angela had severed ties almost completely. She attended obligatory family events, funerals, major holidays, but maintained emotional distance that made clear she wanted nothing to do with the Gotti name or what it represented. She didn't bring her children to visit Victoria often, didn't call regularly, had constructed a life that deliberately excluded most of her family. Victoria understood this was self-preservation, but understanding didn't make the rejection hurt less. The grandchildren were growing up with a legacy they couldn't escape. Victoria watched them navigate schools where teachers knew their last name, neighborhoods where people whispered about their family, futures constrained by associations they hadn't chosen. Some seemed proud of the connection, treating the Gotti name as a badge of honor that commanded respect and fear. Others seemed ashamed, trying to distance themselves from family history while remaining unable to fully separate. Victoria tried to be present for her grandchildren in ways she hadn't managed with her own children. She attended school events, hosted holiday dinners, offered babysitting that gave their parents breaks from constant childcare. But she struggled to know what to tell them about their grandfather, their uncles, the family business that everyone knew about, but no one discussed directly. The children asked questions. Why was Grandpa in prison? Why did people stare at them in public? Why did their last name make adults uncomfortable? And Victoria offered answers that were technically true, but fundamentally dishonest. Money from the life continued to circulate despite John's death and his son's incarcerations. Victoria received envelopes of cash from sources she didn't ask about, payments that arrived monthly like pension checks from an employer who would never be named. She used this money to maintain the house, to help her grandchildren, to fund lawyers for her son's endless appeals. The money was dirty, earned through activities she had spent decades pretending not to know about. But she took it anyway because the alternative was poverty, and she had already sacrificed enough. The pattern repeated across the family. Young men who carried the Gotti name were pulled into the life or chose it themselves, believing they could navigate it more successfully than their predecessors. They were arrested, tried, convicted, imprisoned. The women, wives, girlfriends, mothers, waited for them, visited them, raised their children alone, and watched the cycle continue into the next generation. Victoria saw herself reflected in these younger women, recognizing the same denial, the same bargain that traded security for complicity. She tried to break the pattern with one grandson who showed interest in college, who talked about becoming a lawyer or an accountant, who seemed to want something different. Victoria offered to pay for his education using money she had saved from the monthly envelopes, telling him this was his chance to choose a different path. He accepted the money, enrolled in community college, and dropped out after one semester to work for an uncle, whose business involved activities that would eventually attract federal attention. Victoria stopped trying to save anyone. She understood finally that the legacy was stronger than her intervention, that the name carried obligations enforced not through explicit demand, but through family expectation and masculine pride, and the seductive fiction that this time would be different. Her children and grandchildren would make their own choices, suffer their own consequences, and she would continue doing what she had always done, bearing witness to destruction she couldn't prevent, maintaining loyalty to people who mistook her silence for approval. The house in Howard Beach became a museum to a man who was already disappearing from public memory. Victoria kept John's den exactly as he had left it before his final arrest. The desk where he had conducted business, the chair he favored, photographs of him with associates whose names she had never learned. She cleaned the room weekly, dusting surfaces that accumulated no dust, maintaining space for someone who would never return to occupy it. The photographs multiplied over the years. Victoria hung them throughout the house in arrangements that felt like shrines. John in his expensive suits, John with the children when they were young, John at family weddings and christenings. The images captured him at the height of his power, before prison had diminished him, before cancer had transformed him into someone unrecognizable. She was preserving a version of her husband that contradicted the reality she had lived with, creating a memorial to a man who had never actually existed in the form these photographs suggested. Her days had no structure beyond what she imposed through routine. She woke early out of habit, developed during decades of prison visits that no longer needed making. She cooked meals that were too large for one person and ate portions of them before storing the rest in a refrigerator that gradually filled with containers of food she would eventually throw away uneaten. She watched television for hours, the noise filling silence that felt oppressive when the house was quiet. The neighborhood had changed. Families who had lived on the block for generations were moving away, selling homes to buyers who had no connection to the history these houses contained. New neighbors knew who Victoria was. The internet made that kind of information easily accessible, but they maintained polite distance, offering waves without attempting conversation. She was a historical figure living among people who had no interest in the history she represented. Victoria's health declined in ways that felt inevitable rather than surprising. High blood pressure, arthritis that made movement painful, persistent headaches that doctors attributed to stress but couldn't effectively treat. She took medications that managed symptoms without addressing causes, understanding that her body was responding to decades of tension that had never found release. The physical deterioration mirrored an internal decay she couldn't name, but felt constantly. Her social world had contracted to near nothing. The women who had been her friends during John's rise were mostly dead or had moved away. The younger generation of mob wives kept their distance, treating Victoria as a relic of an era that had ended badly and that they preferred not to be reminded of. She attended family gatherings but sat in corners, an old woman whose presence was acknowledged but whose company was not particularly sought. Money remained a concern. The envelopes of cash arrived less regularly than before, smaller amounts that suggested the sources were drying up, or the people who had felt obligated to support John's widow no longer felt that obligation. Victoria economized in ways that felt humiliating, clipping coupons, shopping at discount stores, deferring home repairs she couldn't afford. The house was deteriorating, its maintenance beyond her means, but she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. She thought often about leaving. There were places she could go, smaller apartments in Queens, assisted living facilities that accepted residents with limited income, even moving in with one of her children, though none had explicitly offered. But leaving the house felt like abandoning John, like admitting that the life they had built together was worth discarding. So she stayed, maintaining a property that was too large for her needs, paying for utilities and taxes that consumed most of her income, preserving something no one else valued. The media occasionally called, reporters working on retrospectives about organized crime in New York, documentary producers wanting interviews about life as a mob wife. Victoria declined all requests. She had nothing to say that anyone wanted to hear. The story people wanted involved either dramatic confessions of complicity or claims of ignorance that would make her seem foolish. Neither version was true, and the actual truth, that she had known and not known simultaneously, that she had chosen not to ask questions she suspected she wouldn't like the answers to, was too complicated to explain to strangers seeking simple narratives. Her grandchildren visited occasionally, brief stops that felt obligatory rather than voluntary. They were polite, asked about her health, stayed for coffee they drank quickly before making excuses about other commitments. Victoria understood she made them uncomfortable. She was a reminder of family history they wanted to move past, an old woman whose loyalty to their grandfather they interpreted as either admirable or pathological, depending on how much distance they had achieved from the life. She received occasional letters from Peter in prison, rambling updates about his appeals and complaints about conditions and requests for money she didn't have to send. The letters arrived irregularly, sometimes multiple in a single week, and then nothing for months. Victoria read them and responded briefly, maintaining contact that felt more like duty than connection. Her son was serving 25 years and would be an old man when released, if he was released at all. The realization that she would likely die before seeing him free made her feel nothing. Not sadness exactly, more like numbness that had settled over emotions too exhausted to function. John III had been released in 2005 after serving 6 years, but his freedom had been brief before new charges led to new trials that consumed years in legal battles. He was eventually acquitted after multiple mistrials, prosecutors unable to convince juries despite evidence that seemed overwhelming. Victoria attended some of these trials but stopped going regularly, too tired to sit through more courtroom proceedings, too familiar with the pattern to need to witness each iteration. Her son's acquittals felt less like victories than like postponements of inevitable outcomes. Victoria spent increasing amounts of time in front of the television, watching shows she didn't care about, falling asleep in the chair John used to occupy, waking in the middle of the night disoriented and alone. The house creaked with sounds she had stopped investigating, settling foundations and aging pipes and small animals that had found ways inside through gaps she didn't have energy to seal. She lived surrounded by deterioration she couldn't halt, watching everything slowly fall apart while lacking the resources or will to prevent it. She thought sometimes about what her life would have been if she had made different choices, if she had never met John, if she had left him after the first arrest, if she had refused to play the role of loyal wife during the trials. But these thoughts led nowhere useful. The past was fixed, unchangeable, and speculation about alternatives felt like torture disguised as reflection. Victoria turned 80 in December 2022. There was no celebration. Her children called, some of them, and a few grandchildren sent cards that arrived late and contained messages that felt copied from generic templates. She spent the day as she spent most days, moving through the house in Howard Beach that had become less a home than a container for accumulated years she couldn't discard and didn't know how to organize into meaning. The stroke came in early 2023, minor enough that she survived but significant enough to alter what remained of her independence. Victoria woke one morning unable to move her left arm, her face drooping on one side, her speech slurred in ways that made her sound drunk. A neighbor found her hours later, having noticed that Victoria's newspapers had been accumulating on the front step. The ambulance ride, the emergency room, the neurological assessments, all of it passed in a blur that Victoria experienced without fully processing. Recovery was partial. Her arm regained some function, but remained weak, fine motor control permanently compromised. Her speech improved, but never returned to normal, words sometimes escaping her or emerging in wrong order. The doctors discussed rehabilitation that insurance would cover for 6 weeks, physical therapy that might restore additional function, if she committed to exercises that required discipline and hope she no longer possessed. Victoria returned to the house with a walker and a prescription for blood thinners. The home health aide, who visited 3 times weekly, was a woman from Trinidad who spoke English with an accent Victoria had to concentrate to understand. The aide helped with bathing, meal preparation, medication management, tasks Victoria had performed independently for 8 decades and now required assistance with. The loss of autonomy felt like confirmation of something she had suspected for years, that she was being reduced gradually, capability stripped away in increments until nothing remained but basic biological function. Her children discussed moving her to assisted living. Victoria heard these conversations through her bedroom wall, Angela and Victoria Jr. talking in the kitchen about facilities they had researched, costs they could potentially manage if everyone contributed, the impossibility of Victoria continuing to live alone in a house that required maintenance she couldn't perform. They spoke about her as though she were already incapable of decision-making, their tones mixing concern with frustration that she had become their responsibility. Victoria refused to move. The house, with all its decay and memories, remained the only physical space that connected her to the life she had lived. Leaving it would mean acknowledging that life was completely over, that she had become someone whose only function was waiting for death in a facility designed to make that waiting as efficient as possible. She told her children she was staying, her slurred speech making the declaration sound weaker than she intended, but the firmness underneath was recognizable enough that they stopped arguing. The neighborhood continued its transformation around her. The Italian families were almost entirely gone now, replaced by professionals who worked in Manhattan and used Howard Beach as a bedroom community. They renovated the old houses, adding modern kitchens and converting basements into media rooms, erasing the architectural history of working-class lives that had occupied these spaces for generations. Victoria watched through her window as the house across the street was gutted, its interior stripped to studs, everything familiar removed to make room for something new. She received fewer visitors as months passed. The home health aide came on schedule, performing her duties with professional competence, but without warmth. A priest from her church visited monthly, bringing communion and brief prayers that Victoria endured rather than welcomed. Her grandchildren stopped coming almost entirely, their obligations apparently fulfilled by phone calls that grew shorter and less frequent. The television remained on most hours, its noise substituting for human company. Victoria watched shows about cooking and home renovation and people traveling to places she would never see. She watched news programs that discussed current events she had no stake in, political conflicts that would be resolved or not resolved without her input mattering at all. The world continued without requiring anything from her, a realization that brought relief mixed with something else she couldn't name. She thought about Frank often. Her son would have been 54 if he had lived, possibly with children of his own, possibly having chosen a different path than his brothers. Or possibly not. Possibly he would have followed John into the life, been arrested and imprisoned, continued the pattern that had consumed her other sons. She would never know, and the not knowing had become its own form of grief, different from the acute pain of his death, but more persistent. A question that could never be answered, but wouldn't stop being asked. The photographs throughout the house documented a family that no longer existed in the form they suggested. Young children who were now middle-aged adults dealing with their own failures and disappointments. A husband who had been dead for over 20 years, but whose image still dominated the walls, frozen in a moment of power and confidence that had preceded the long decline. Victoria was the only one left to fully remember. She had outlived almost everyone who appeared in these photographs, survived into an era where the Gotti name meant less with each passing year, slowly being forgotten by a city that had moved on to newer scandals and different criminals. Victoria's days blurred together into routines that marked time without filling it. Morning medications, breakfast she sometimes remembered to eat, hours in front of the television, lunch delivered by a service her daughter had arranged, more television, dinner often consisting of whatever required minimal preparation, evening medications, sleep that came fitfully, interrupted by pain or confusion or the simple restlessness of a body that had outlasted its purpose. She understood she was waiting, not for anything specific, no particular event or reunion or resolution, and just waiting for the biological process to complete itself, for the failing heart and compromised circulation and accumulating cellular damage to finish what they had begun. She had no fear of death. What she feared was the continuation of this, more years of diminishment, more losses of function, more days passing without meaning or connection, or anything that might justify the effort of continuing. The house creaked at night. Victoria lay in bed listening to sounds that were probably just settling foundations and temperature changes, but that sometimes felt like something else. Ghosts of people who had lived here, memories that had soaked into the walls and now leaked back out in the darkness. She heard Frank laughing in his bedroom that was now used for storage. She heard John's voice from the den, conducting business she had trained herself not to hear. She heard her own younger self calling children to dinner, maintaining the fiction that they were a normal family living normal lives. Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti remains alive as of this writing, living in the house in Howard Beach that has served as both home and prison for over 40 years. She is 82 years old. The public has largely forgotten her, if it ever knew her at all. When John Gotti's name appears in documentaries or true crime retrospectives, Victoria is mentioned briefly, if at all. A footnote, a supporting character, the wife who stood beside him in courtroom photographs, but whose interior life was never considered worthy of examination. The narrative of John Gotti has been told countless times. His rise to power, his flamboyant defiance of law enforcement, his eventual downfall. These are stories that fit comfortably into existing frameworks about ambition and hubris in American crime. Victoria's story resists this kind of telling. It offers no clear arc of redemption or damnation, no moment of dramatic realization, no satisfying conclusion that would allow an audience to categorize her experience and move on. What remains are questions without answers. Did Victoria know the full extent of what John did, or did she construct an elaborate architecture of selective ignorance that allowed her to remain married to him while avoiding moral responsibility? Did she stay out of love, or fear, or economic necessity, or simply because leaving would have required imagination of alternatives she didn't possess? Did her loyalty protect her children, or doom them? Did her silence make her complicit? Or was it the only survival strategy available to a woman with limited options and resources? The house in Howard Beach contains no answers to these questions. It contains only photographs and furniture and the accumulated debris of a life spent adjacent to power, that protected nothing Victoria actually needed. Her husband is dead. Her sons are imprisoned or damaged. Her grandchildren carry a legacy they didn't choose and cannot escape. And Victoria remains, the last witness to a story she was never allowed to tell in her own voice, living in rooms that feel haunted not by the dead, but by all the versions of herself she might have become if different choices had been available or if she had been capable of recognizing them as choices at all. The Gotti name persists in public memory as shorthand for organized crime's last era of theatrical visibility. But Victoria DiGiorgio's name appears in no headlines. Her devotion purchased nothing. Her silence protected no one. She was shaped by proximity to immense power and quietly broken by it, spending 8 decades learning that loyalty offered as substitute for agency is simply another form of disappearance.